good to go? It was vibrating. Ready? All right, let's begin. Let's stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right. Tonight we're going to, we'll approve the minutes. We'll have public participation before we get into voting. I'll go over the voting procedures for our new folks and just to refresh us all. And then we'll vote, and then we'll take up other business. All right, is there a motion to approve the minutes from our November 1st meeting?
I make a motion.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. We'll move on to public participation. We have one person signed up. A reminder that you have 3 minutes. When you have 30 seconds remaining, you'll see a yellow light. When your time has expired, you will see a red light and hear a tone.
At the SBAC's first meeting of its current appointment cycle, it appointed Molly Colony, the Board of Education Senior Aide, as its secretary. While I can understand why none of you would want to serve in this thankless, uncompensated position, it is totally inappropriate for Ms. Connolly to be given that position, as she has a blatant conflict of interest in exercising it, which is another way of saying that she has an ethical conflict. If you need a paid secretary, the Maryland General Assembly should have provided funding for such a position or assigned you one from its own staff. As I have repeatedly explained to both SBAC and its predecessor, it is already totally inappropriate to have the school board's PR office control the SBAC's records. You should be ashamed when over the years capital education reporters have repeatedly had to contact me to learn the most basic information about the various selection commissions' histories, because that information was either not posted or subsequently removed from your website, although retained by the school board and other insiders should they want to see it. As a basic principle of good governance, the role of agents and principals should be clearly separated. Principals should select agents and not vice versa. More specifically, elected officials are not supposed to control the monitoring of themselves, including keeping so-called public records for themselves. For example, the National Records and Archives Administration is placed outside the control of the president. Similarly, when a special prosecutor investigates the president is not supposed to have a mole in the special prosecutor's office. Consistent with good government principles, I hope you will appoint a secretary from among your members or petition the General Assembly to grant you funds to hire a secretary consistent with the huge responsibility the public has entrusted in you. If the county and state can afford to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to administer the country's liquor board, it should be able to spend a few $1,000s to administer this election commission. Indeed, I would argue that the leadership of the public schools is far more important to the future well-being of our citizenry than the liquor board. For example, the liquor board administers approximately $1 million in annual revenue, the school board more than 1,000 times as much. Molly Connolly's appointment as secretary clearly violates basic good governance and ethics principles. Rather than deliberate on this issue in the back room, you should do so publicly. And if you refuse to do so today, then you should convene a special public meeting to discuss this and other administrative issues publicly. The SBAC's culture of deliberating on and deciding on its most important procedural issues outside the reach of the Open Meetings Law should be ended. Lastly, I probably wouldn't have come and testified tonight if I hadn't been so annoyed by being removed from the email list providing public notice of this meeting. Thank you. If you have any questions, I am a depository of procedural information about the history of this commission and the preceding one. And for those that are new, I put together some 10-page memory of the history of malfeasance, procedural malfeasance, mostly, of course, the preceding one. And of course, the chair is very familiar with that history and has had some significant impacts on this institution as it's evolved over the last decade. So if you have any questions, again, I'd be happy to answer them.
Are there any questions for Mr. Snyder?
I would just like to ask a question. I believe that it was my understanding that we did not appoint a secretary at all.
That's correct. We delayed the decision because we weren't all here.
Oh, I thought at your
And
first
nobody-
meeting, nobody was interested and you made the appointment.
We made no appointment. We just said that it was
Oh,
still
well,
open.
That's correct.
designated. That's the same thing.
Yeah, that's correct.
And I was willing to put my name in for secretary, but seeing that it was the first time I was behind the dais, I did want a few minutes to get some meetings under my belt first. But this appointment commission is not long for this world. So it's a little bit moot to put my name forward at this point. But if that need is there, I'm happy to do so.
Any other questions for Mr. Snyder?
Lisa would do a great job. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, moving on. Is there any other public participation? All right, we're moving on. I'm going to go through the voting procedure before we begin. It's been a little while since any of us voted, and there's some new folks. Voting will begin with each commissioner writing the names of up to 3 candidates on the ballot, and you have one larger ballot to do that. There's no specific order to the named candidates and no weight assigned to them in terms of points. Ballots will be collected and read aloud by staff, and each named candidate will be recorded with a single tally. Commissioners will be asked to confirm their ballots. And then the 3 candidates plus any ties who receive the most tallies will advance to the next round. All others will be eliminated from consideration. To be clear, no candidate can be appointed on that first round. The round is intended solely to narrow the field to a group of finalists. We have staff members counting votes, and staff will confer to double-check the vote totals after the first round. The 3 candidates receiving the most vote tallies, again, plus any ties, will advance. Once that round is complete, voting in a round-by-round format will commence. Each commissioner will cast a written ballot naming a single candidate of that commissioner's preference. Ballots will be collected and read aloud by staff. Votes will be recorded. If a candidate receives the legally required 8 or more votes in any round, that candidate is appointed to the Board of Education. It is mathematically impossible for 2 candidates to receive 8 or more votes. If no candidate receives 8 votes in a given round, any candidate not receiving a single vote will be eliminated from consideration. If all candidates receive at least 1 vote, the field remains the same. The subsequent round of voting will then be conducted with the remaining candidates eligible to receive votes. This process will continue until a candidate receives at least the necessary 8 votes. After each round, I will ask if any commissioners wish to make any comments. Once we begin the voting, we will continue voting until we have an appointment. If we reach a point where the commission feels we need to take a break, we will do so. However, we will take a break one at a time. We'll only leave the dais one at a time. The candidate appointed tonight will be sworn in along with the 4 recently elected board members at 9 a.m. on Monday, December 3rd at the courthouse in Annapolis, the county courthouse. Are there any questions? Okay. So begin with round 1, write round 1 in the corner of your largest ballot.
And I will ask each commissioner to confirm what I read here after I read them. So Commissioner Rivera has voted for Mr. Leone, Mr. Leib, and Mr. McCrease. Commissioner Uribe has voted for Mr. McCrease, Ms. Quincosa, and Mr. Leib.
Correct.
Commissioner Barber has voted for Mr. Leib, Ms. Snell, and Mr. Leone.
Correct.
Commissioner Jones has voted for Mr. Leone, Mr. Leib, and Ms. Miles. Commissioner Shore has voted for Mr. McCrease, Mr. Leib, and Ms. Snell. Commissioner Klassmeyer has voted for Mr. Leib, Mr. McCrease, and Ms. Snell.
Correct.
Commissioner Ferrara has voted for Mr. Leib, Mr. Hussein, and Mr. McCrease. Ms. Alsop has voted for Ms. Snell, Mr. McCrease, and Mr. Hussein. Commissioner Frank has voted for Mr. Leib, Mr. McCrease, and Mr. Hussein.
Correct.
Commissioner Liberatore has voted for Mr. Leone, Mr. McCrease, and Ms. Snell.
That's correct.
Commissioner Carter has voted for Mr. McCrease, Ms. Snell, and Mr. Leib.
That's correct.
Chairman Kipke has voted for Mr. Leib, Mr. McCrease, and Mr. Hussein. All right, so give us a minute to do a little math here.
This one's wrong. This is wrong. Okay. 4, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4.
4, 10, 4. 4, 10, 4, 10, yeah. We have 10 here.
What do you have?
I just want to double check a balance. What do you have here? Move your finger. This goes up
That
here.
goes up
This
here.
goes up
That's
there.
it.
Okay, so the totals are Mr. Hussein, 4 votes, Mr. Leib, 10 votes, Mr. Leone, 4 votes, Mr. McCrease, 10 votes, Ms. McQuaid, no votes, Ms. Miles, 1 vote, Ms. Quincosa, 1 vote, Mr. Schneider, no votes, Ms. Snell, 6 votes. So the 3 that advance are Mr. Leib, Mr. McCrease, and Ms. Snell. Thank you. Okay. Round 2, Commissioner Rivera has voted for Mr. McCrease.
That's correct.
Commissioner Uribe has voted for Mr. McCrease.
Correct.
Commissioner Barber has voted for Mr. Leib.
Correct.
Commissioner Jones has voted for Mr. Leib. Commissioner Shore has voted for Mr. McCrease. Commissioner Klassmeyer has voted for Mr. Leib.
That's correct.
Commissioner Ferrara has voted for Mr. Leib. Commissioner Alsop has voted for Mr. McCrease.
Correct.
Commissioner Frank has voted for Mr. Leib.
Correct.
Commissioner Liberatore has voted for Ms. Snell.
Correct.
Commissioner Carter has voted for Mr. McCrease. And Commissioner Kipke has voted, Chairman Kipke has voted for Mr. Leib. So Mr. Leib has 6, Mr. McCrease has 5, Ms. Snell has 1, no one has the requisite 8, and all 3 advance to round 3.
I haven't yet offered the chance to explain your vote, and I'm so sorry. Would anybody like to comment on your vote or explain your vote before we move on to round 3? Okay. So round 3, Commissioner Rivera has voted for Mr. McCrease. Commissioner Uribe has voted for Mr. McCrease.
That's correct.
Commissioner Barber votes for Mr. Leib.
Correct.
Commissioner Jones votes for Mr. Leib. Commissioner Shore votes for Mr. McCrease. Commissioner Klassmeyer votes for Mr. Leib.
Correct.
Commissioner Ferrara votes for Mr. Leib. Commissioner Alsop votes for Mr. McCrease.
Correct.
Commissioner Frank votes for Mr. Leib.
Correct.
Commissioner Liberatore votes for Mr. McCrease.
Correct.
Commissioner Carter votes for Mr. McCrease.
Correct.
And Commissioner Kipke votes for Mr. Leib. So Mr. Leib has 6, Mr. McCrease has 6, Ms. Snell has 0, and she is eliminated.
Right. Because you have 12.
Would you like to explain your vote?
I would. Oh, no. Okay, go ahead first. I would just like to advocate for Mr. Leib. I think that we've all come in here knowing that we had 2 very strong candidates, and I know that the military background is something that we were looking at for this board. I would just advocate for Mr. Leib because he seems like he has some familiarity with this board, or with the school board already, and because he seems to have a little bit more free time, and I think that that's really important in a board member.
I also want to encourage all my fellow commissioners to take a look at what the current makeup of the Board of Education is and to figure out what's missing. And I believe we have about 10% of our kids in the public school system that have connections with the military. I think both candidates offer that, but I think that's a really important piece that both candidates bring to the table.
Round 4. Commissioner Rivera votes for Mr. McCrease. Commissioner Uribe votes for Mr. McCrease. Commissioner Barber votes for Mr. Leib. Commissioner Jones votes for Mr. Leib. Commissioner Shore votes for Mr. Leib. Commissioner Klassmeyer votes for Mr. Leib.
Correct.
Commissioner Ferrara votes for Mr. Leib. Commissioner Alsop votes for Mr. McCrease.
Correct.
Commissioner Frank votes for Mr. Leib.
Correct.
Commissioner Liberatore votes for Mr. McCrease.
Correct.
Commissioner Carter votes for Mr. McCrease.
That is correct.
And Chairman Kippy, you left your ballot blank. Chairman Kipke votes for Mr. Leib. So Mr. Leib has 7, Mr. McCrease has 5, none having the requisite 8, both move to the next round.
Would anyone like to explain your vote before we move on to round 5? Okay. Five.
Round 5. Commissioner Rivera votes for Mr. Leib. What's that? Commissioner Uribe votes for Mr. McCrease. Commissioner Barber votes for Mr. Leib. Commissioner Jones votes for Mr. Leib. Commissioner Shore votes for Mr. Leib. Commissioner Klassmeyer votes for Mr. Leib.
Correct.
Commissioner Ferrara votes for Mr. Leib.
That's correct.
Commissioner Alsop votes for Mr. McCrease.
Correct.
Commissioner Frank votes for Mr. Libe.
Correct.
Commissioner Liberatore votes for Mr. McCrease.
Correct.
Commissioner Carter votes for Mr. McCrease.
Correct.
Chairman Kipke votes for Mr. Libe. Mr. Libe has 8, Mr. McCrease 4, and Mr. Libe is appointed to the Board of Education.
Congratulations. We have a letter to you folks after this. We send a letter making it. All right. Is there any other business? Okay. Is there a motion to adjourn?
There's a motion to adjourn.
Okay. Well, I'll take both motions. I'll take one as a motion and one as a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay.